welcome you all today to the Buddhist Society online. This is our 97th anniversary, I believe. So we're really approaching a very big day. The foundation of the Buddhist Society was dependent on a number of important events in the late 19th century, not least of them publication of The Light of Asia. And The Light of Asia had an enormous influence on a large number of people all over the world. It was translated into many languages. And today we have the good fortune to have with us a speaker who wrote the book, Jairam Ramesh. But first of all, when Bhante reappears, he'll say a few little words of introduction. The Chisik Vihara and the Buddhist Society have a kind of sort of joint history, because through the Maha Bodhi Society and through Dharmapala, who was influenced again by this particular book, The Light of Asia, written by Sir Edwin Arnold, influenced those early members of people like Olcott and so on, who then came to Sri Lanka. And it was through their interest in Buddhism, through reading The Light of Asia, that Madame Blavatsky, Olcott, and others became very interested in Buddhism, came to Sri Lanka, and that was how Dharmapala became also interested. And this formed the seed in some ways of Sri Lankan nationalism in the right kind of way, and also led to the reopening of all the major Buddhist sites, and eventually led to the opening of the first Buddhist temple, fully flourishing Buddhist temple in the United Kingdom, the Chisik Vihara. So Dharmapala came over here around 1926, and it was really at a meeting with all the Buddhists that were in London at the time, including Christopher Humphreys and the original sort of nascent group of British Buddhists. And they decided basically that Christopher Humphreys decided he would go his way and found the Buddhist Society, which would be open to all schools of Buddhism. And Dharmapala founded essentially the Buddhist Society through the auspices of the Maha Bodhi Society. And that's how we are where we are today. But I suppose it's really the theosophical movement that was so profoundly influenced by Sir Edwin Arnold. But Bhante, thank you so much. Can you hear us? Can you hear? I think you're muted.
I can hear you.
Good. Well, it's very lovely you could join us. I know you're going on a retreat now, but perhaps you could just say a few words before you go off.
Thank you so much for inviting to join with us today. Especially, I'm so happy to see our good friend, Dr. Desmond Biddulph, the chairman of the Buddhist Society, and also the speaker, Mr. Jairam Ramesh, the author of the new book, The Light of Asia. I'm so inspired looking at your new book, The Light of Asia. As Desmond said, the London Buddhist Vihara and Buddhist Society are actually started in the same period in the history of Britain. At the same time, the London Buddhist Vihara was founded by Anagarika Dharmapala. He was the messenger of the Buddhism from Sri Lanka as results of the great revival in Buddhism in Sri Lanka at the end of the 19th century and also beginning of the 20th century. As we are aware that first book, The Light of Asia, was written by Sir Edwin Arnold. At the age of 24, Edwin Arnold went to India as the principal of Deccan College in Pune. So then he was fascinated looking at the very rich culture in India. I learned something. He learned not only Buddhism, he learned Sanskrit and Pali language, and also he learned Mahabharata as well. Then Lalita Vistara, the Tibetan Buddhist epic of Buddha. So having read all these great epic literature, he came back to England and started to write this book, Light of Asia. It is actually the wonderful poem about the life of the Buddha. In 1879, it was published in England and reprinted numerous times. Many thousands of people came to know about the Buddha for the first time. This way, the Buddha's message touched the British land with the help of this Light of Asia book. We should be grateful. And I'm very much inspired Jairam Ramesh work, the Light of Asia new book. With this juncture, I'm very happy to convey my blessings to the Buddhist Society and also to this seminar for the success of all these talks and this event. My blessings from the London Buddhist Vihara to everyone, blessings of the Buddha to everyone. Bhavato sabba mangalam rakhanto sabba devata sabba buddhanubhavena sada soti bhavantu te. Bhavato sabba mangalam rakhanto sabba devata sabba dhammanubhavena sada soti bhavantu te. Bhavato sabba mangalam rakhanto sabba devata sabba sanganubhavena sada soti bhavantu te. Thank you. Thank you, Desmond.
Hello, everybody. I just want to hold up the book. This is the book. I've read it with absolute fascination. It's a real page turner. It's a wonderful book to read. It's very extensive. There's a massive amount of research in it. I just don't know how you manage to find time, with your busy life, to be able to do it. I just can't understand it. It's an incredible piece of work. It's a wonderful piece of scholarship. It's entertaining, it's enlivening, and it's also stimulating too. Made me think a lot about that particular period in history and how formative it was. And it's a great book. So please, if those of you who haven't read it, please do. But Sir Edwin Arnold was, as I said before, was really important in the history of the Buddhist Society. And we're very lucky to have the author of this book with us today on this very special day, our 97th anniversary. So Jairam, our speaker, Jairam Ramesh, is an MP. He was born in 1954. He's an economist and a politician. He belongs to the Indian National Congress. He's a member of Parliament, representing the Karnataka state in Rajya Sabha. In July 2011, he was elevated to the Council of Ministers of India and appointed Minister of Rural Development and new Ministry of Drinking Water and Sanitation. He was previously Minister of State of the Minister of the Environment and Forest from May 2009 to July 2011. But he's also written other things. He's well-known books including Indira Gandhi, A Life in Nature and Intertwined Lives, P.N. Aksha and Indira Gandhi, and his last book, A Checkered Brilliance, The Many Lives of Krishna Menon. which won the Kamala Devi Chattopadhyaya New India Foundation Book Prize in 2020. So thank you very much. I know it's very late at night for you over there. So thank you very much for coming on, giving us this talk on this very special day for us. But please, this is the book. Go out and buy it. It's a wonderful book to have in your library. It really is. Thank you very much. I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you, Dr. Biddulph. Thank you very much. And coincidentally, today's Daily Telegraph, of which Sir Edwin Arnold was the editor in the late 19th century, coincidentally, today itself, it carries a book review by Mick Brown, a very noted journalist and a scholar and a student of Buddha and Buddhism, who has made many visits to the London Buddhist Society. So it just happens to be a coincidence that this morning, the Daily Telegraph has carried a review of this book. And I'm delighted to have this opportunity of speaking to the London Buddhist Society. This is a society with which Sir Edwin Arnold had a close relationship even after his death in 1904. Because in June of 1932, when the birth centenary of Sir Edwin Arnold was being marked, his son, one of his sons, Emerson Arnold, gifted the armchair of which his father used for writing this epic poem. He gifted this armchair to the Buddhist Society, which I believe is still, which greets the visitors to the Buddhist Society. And there is a portrait of Sir Edwin Arnold in the library of the London Buddhist Society. And Emerson Arnold donated his entire collection of Buddhist art to the Buddhist Society. Christmas Humphreys, the founder of the Buddhist Society, who was also a Theosophical movement, a very active member of the Theosophical movement and the Theosophical Society, was a great admirer of Sir Edwin Arnold and The Light of Asia. The Light of Asia was published in 1879. And the 19th century, the period 1820 to 1880, was really a period of the rediscovery of Buddha and Buddhism, largely by English and French and German scholars, but with the help of many Indian and Nepali and Sri Lankan interlocutors as well. First, we had the epigraphical rediscovery of the Buddha. That was in the early part of the 19th century. Then we had the archaeological rediscovery of the Buddha by Sir Alexander Cunningham, the founder of the Archaeological Society of India, the Archaeological Survey of India. And then we had the textual discovery of the Buddha through the translations of Pali works, Chinese works, some Sanskrit works, and some Japanese works. But the one book that made the Buddha a household name across the European continent, in the UK, in the US, and of course, all over Asia, was Sir Edwin Arnold's epic poem, 1879, called The Light of Asia, or The Great Renunciation. It's a 50,000-line poem divided into 8 books. And it really is on the life of the Buddha. It's not a book on Buddhism per se, but it's a book on the life of the Buddha. It focuses on the humanity of the Buddha. It doesn't focus on the divinity of Buddha, but it focuses on the humanity of the Buddha. And to use today's language, it is this poem really that went viral, and it popularized the life of the Buddha, who was then a subject of scholarly study by scholars like Max Muller or Rhys Davids or Alexander Cunningham, for instance. So what Edwin Arnold did, because he was an influential member of the British establishment, a great lover of Indian culture, a great lover of Indian literature, a translator of many Indian books, Sanskrit books like the Bhagavad Gita and the Mahabharata. So what Sir Edwin Arnold did was to take the life of the Buddha out of the confines of Oxford and, the British Library and the British Museum, and out of the arena of scholarly analysis, and brought the life of the Buddha into the public domain. And very soon, over the next 20 years, you will find that the poem was translated into some 15 European languages, including Russian, for instance, thanks to the interest shown in it by Leo Tolstoy. It got translated into over 10 Asian languages, including Japanese, Thai, Khmer, and so on. And of course, it got translated into over 12 Indian languages. So it became a sensation across the world, both a literary sensation. It also became a cultural sensation. It became the subject of opera. It became the subject of music compositions. It became the subject of a film made in German, a film made in English in 1925 on the life of the Buddha called The Light of Asia. So it had multiple impacts. It had literary impacts. It had cultural impacts. And of course, in India, it had social impacts because through the translations, Buddha became the figure of social emancipation. Buddha became the symbol of social protest against the upper caste orthodoxy and the subjugation of large numbers of people because of the accident of their birth. So Buddha was seen not just as a philosophical figure. Buddha was not just seen as a spiritual figure. Buddha was seen not just as a figure who gave the world a system of personal ethics and personal morality, but also a figure of social revolution. And this was particularly true in the Indian context. And right through the 20th century, the life of the Buddha becomes a very important instrument of the Indian nationalist movement. Those elements who were concerned not just with political independence from Britain, but also with social reform within India, of which, of course, Mahatma Gandhi was the most well-known and most influential figure. Now, Sir Edwin Arnold himself, as I said, was a member of the British establishment, the quintessential Victorian, who went out to India in 1857, was principal of a college in Western India, fell in love with Indian literature, became fluent in Sanskrit and a couple of other Indian languages, came back to London as a leader writer and subsequently the editor of the Daily Telegraph, a position which gave him influence and standing in Victorian England. He was a minor poet. He was not considered a serious poet. He was considered a minor poet. He was considered to be an Oriental poet because all his works were translations of either Sanskrit or Persian works. But it was through the publication in 1879 of The Light of Asia that he became a household name, not only in England, but across the continent, across the Atlantic, and of course, in India. He comes to the subcontinent in 1886. He spends 100 days in India and what was then Ceylon. He goes to Bodh Gaya, the place where the Buddha got enlightenment, or more accurate to say, Gautama Siddhartha got enlightenment and became the Buddha. And he found in Bodh Gaya that the control of the Maha Bodhi temple was being exercised by Hindu priests. And Edwin Arnold thought that this was blasphemous because this was a place which is the Mecca for Buddhism. And this was a place where Buddha had been emancipated, and therefore he believed that it should rightly be controlled by the Buddhist community of India and of Asia. And in 1886, he writes a series of articles in the Daily Telegraph. And he influences a Ceylonese scholar monk activist called Anagarika Dharmapala, who then launches this campaign for the liberation of the Maha Bodhi temple from the control of Hindu priests. And this campaign lasts almost 70 years. And it's only on the 28th of May, 1953, long after Sir Edwin Arnold has passed away, long after Dharmapala had passed away, that the control of the Maha Bodhi temple passes from the Hindu priests to a management committee, of which 50% are Hindus and 50% are Buddhists. And subsequently, of course, Bodh Gaya becomes a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Dharmapala, incidentally, plays a very crucial role in the rediscovery of India's Buddhist heritage in the 20th century, not just by his efforts at Bodh Gaya, but also by his efforts to revive and restore the glory of Sarnath, which is the place where the Buddha gave his first sermon. Now, Sir Edwin Arnold, of course, exercised a tremendous influence, literary influence, on people like Rudyard Kipling, on people like T.S. Eliot, James Joyce, and of course, in the Indian context, the great Indian cultural figure and poet Rabindranath Tagore. He also exercised a great influence on Indian political figures like Mahatma Gandhi and India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru. And quite extraordinarily, he exercised an influence on Winston Churchill. And I discovered in the archives of Jawaharlal Nehru, which I have used in my book, letters that Winston Churchill wrote to Nehru in 1955 on his impending retirement, and he's recalling the light of Asia. He's telling Mr. Nehru that remember the light of Asia. And I found that quite extraordinary that Winston Churchill, in his 80s would be recalling the light of Asia to his Indian counterpart. So this book really was born out of a fascination and captivation that I've long had with the life of the Buddha. I'm not a Buddhist in the traditional religious sense of the term, but in the DNA of every Indian lies the life of the Buddha. Buddha is very much part of our lives, day-to-day lives, and there is no Indian home where you will not find an image, a photo or a stone icon carving of the Buddha as the one that I'm holding in my hand. So it was born out of this lifelong interest in the life of the Buddha. And my belief that India is a divinity surplus, humanity deficit country, and if we have to rediscover humanity, we have to really rediscover Buddha, not without necessarily getting into the dogma of what constitutes Buddhism, but certainly the life of the Buddha, the system of personal ethics and morality that he preached. After all, as I explain in my book, the Buddha didn't become the Buddha by following a Buddha. Buddha did not say that I'm a god, I'm a divine figure. Buddha ultimately said, be your own guide, be your own light, be your own experimenter. I read this poem when I was 15 years old, almost 50 years ago, and it remained with me. I read this poem because it just happened to be in my father's library, and I picked it up and I read it, and it just stuck in my mind. Last year, I decided that I must try to understand and explain the reason why this poem was so phenomenally successful and why it became such an important and crucial milestone in Buddhist historiography. Today, of course, Buddhist scholars will not remember this poem. I spoke to Richard Gombrich, one of the greatest scholars of Buddhism at Oxford. And he told me that he had read this poem as a youth, as a young man, but he's not read it afterwards, but he doubts whether any serious student of Buddhism reads this poem. It's true. The poem is passé, as they say. But there was a time, the late 19th century and the early 20th century, when in the popular imagination, in the popular discourse, the life of the Buddha was as defined in this poem. Edwin Arnold depended on Pali sources. He depended on French sources. He depended on certain Sanskrit works as well. But he wrote in his own unique poetic style, a poem, an epic poem, and not a prose. It was not a biography, but it was a poem on the life of the Buddha and his teaching. Most importantly, I think what Edwin Arnold did was to demystify through the poem the concept of nirvana. Nirvana was seen as a nihilistic, negative, life-withdrawing concept. But through the poem, Edwin Arnold succeeded in conveying the idea that nirvana was actually something that you strive for as part of your day-to-day existence. Sort of be in the world, but not of the world. You can be in the world, but not of the world. So, and it was that, I think, was one of the reasons for the success, that he gave a new interpretation to the concept of nirvana and debunked this notion that nirvana is something that is born out of a withdrawal from day-to-day life. And of course, the word nirvana then became the name given to rock music bands. It became the name given to various musical productions. So the word nirvana itself got popular currency on account of this poem. So I don't know how Dr. Biddulph wants to take this, but that's broadly what I want to say, that this poem exercised such a profound influence on personalities across the world, on writers, on authors, on poets, on scientists, and on the public through its translations into many languages. And incidentally, it's a theosophical society. And Christmas Humphreys himself was a theosophist before he founded the Buddhist Society in the 1920s. The Theosophical Society, of which Dr. Annie Besant was the most well-known name. It was founded, of course, by Madame Blavatsky and Henry Steele Olcott. But through the Theosophical Society, these various translations got done. And even today, as I speak to you, this poem is getting translated. It got translated a couple of years ago into Chinese. And it's getting translated, this year, last year too, into smaller Indian languages, which are spoken in particular regions of India. So it's as I said, it's not a scholarly poem. It's not a poem on Buddhism. It's not a guide to Buddhist practice. But it's certainly a guide to the understanding of the life of the Buddha. And what I do in this book is really provide a two-in-one biography. It's a biography of a poem, and it's also the biography of a poet, an unusual man who was a great believer in Victorian rule in India. He did not believe in the political independence of India, but he was somebody who was completely obsessed, fascinated, immersed in India's cultural legacy, as exemplified by many of its great Sanskrit works, which he ended translating into English. He translated Persian poetry. He translated Arabic poetry. He wrote a poem on the 99 names of the Allah, for instance. He wrote a book on Turkish grammar. And of course, as every member of the British establishment of that era, he was fluent in Latin. He wrote in Latin and Greek as well. Let me end by saying that as I was writing this book, I discovered Sir Edwin Arnold's legacy, not just through the poem, but through his great-grandchildren. And I found one set of great-grandchildren in Australia, in Thailand, and in London. But more interestingly, I found one set of grandchildren in Bhopal, in India, with wonderfully syncretic names like Michael Muhammad Arnold. Because Edwin Arnold's granddaughter was brought up by Christian missionaries in India. Edwin Arnold's grandson was brought up by a Muslim noble family. So one strand of Edwin Arnold's descendants became Christian. Another strand of his descendants followed Islam, and there was a beautiful combination of Islam and Christianity in the legacy of this man who did so much to popularize Buddhism. So I think or Buddha at least. So he was a very ecumenical figure. He was not a figure. He was not particularly interested in Christianity. In fact, he fought against British efforts to popularize through missionary activity, conversion activities in western part of India when he was principal of the Pune College. So he was a bit of a dissenter when it came to the Anglican Church, the power of the church. He was a great believer in the power of science, and he wrote extensively on the relationship between science and Buddhism. In all his trips to Japan, for instance, this was the period of scientific discovery as well, and he was at great pains to point out that Buddhism, in fact, is a very scientific faith, that Buddha was in fact the first experimenter. He was a man who first said, do your own experiments, be your own scientist, so to speak. I also discovered, if I'm not embarrassing Dr. Biddulph, that Sir Edwin Arnold's second wife, Catherine, was a Biddulph. So I'm sure that there must be some, in the distant past, Dr. Desmond Biddulph's ancestors may have some relationship with Sir Edwin Arnold's second wife, Catherine, who was with him in India and who traveled with him to Bodh Gaya as well as to Ceylon and met with a lot of Sri Lankan monks. And certainly, she met with Dharmapala before she passed away in the 1880s. So let me once again thank Dr. Biddulph for giving me this opportunity of speaking to you on this book. For me, it was a labor of love. I wrote from my head, but I felt from my heart. It's something that I've always wanted to do. In all my efforts at making people aware of this book in India, I have been at pains to point out that this is a book on the life of the Buddha. This is not a book on Buddhism per se. And that, while Buddhism, whether one wants to be a Buddhist or not, in the religious and the ritualistic sense of the term, is a personal decision, is a decision of personal faith. I think all of us would do well to recall the life of the Buddha, the teachings of the Buddha, and put them into practice in our day-to-day lives. And that, I think, was the value of this poem. And that's what prompted me to write this book. So I hope that all of you will have an opportunity of reading this book. It's a biography of this wonderful man, a wonderful Orientalist, a man who was British in every sense of the term, but at the same time, who was truly a global citizen. He not only, as I said, translated Sanskrit, Persian, Arabic, and Turkish works. He also, his third wife, after his second wife passed away, was Japanese. And he developed skills in the Japanese language. And he was an indefatigable champion of the Anglo-Japanese alliance. in the late 19th and early 20th century, something which we take for granted today. So thank you, Dr. Biddulph, for giving me this wonderful opportunity to be with you. And I hope someday, hopefully next year, I would be able to visit the London Buddhist Society and actually sit on the armchair which Sir Edwin Arnold sat on while writing this poem, and also have an opportunity of seeing this wonderful portrait of his in the library of the London Buddhist Society. Thank you.
So much. Can you hear me now? Yes. Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. And the book is really most entertaining. So those of you who weren't here at the beginning, please do. It's well worth read for many, many reasons, not just because of Buddhism, because it encompasses that whole period, that whole really important period, you see, between 1820 and sort of 1920, that 100 years, which was so formative in laying the seeds for the modern world in which we live. And it struck me when I was reading it that the sort of seeds of globalization, not just in terms of, the relinquishing of colonial interests and so on, but actually the transference of knowledge and understanding and wisdom from other countries to England, particularly when England and the Western world was faced with a crisis in a way, because science started to undermine religious values. And here we have a religion which doesn't require God, doesn't require a primogenitor, it doesn't require any of these ideas, and yet it incorporates in it all the values of a really wonderful, deep and profound religion. And I think this also contributed in some way to the view in which we had of our colonies and countries which we rather which in the English way rather looked down on and thought of as not equal and so on. So certainly elevated in the minds of those people who had really contact with this profound teachings of the Buddha, that it was something on a par with, if not superior, to the things which we had held so dearly. But I was, there's a number of questions here, and I'll have a look at these. One of them is a bit on the sort of political side. It says, it's from Chaka Vagesi. And he says, what do you think about the Buddhist revivalism in the land of its origins?
Well, India presents a paradox. Buddhism has disappeared from India, but Buddha has not. Buddha is very much part of the Indian landscape. Buddha is very much part of the Indian literary landscape, cultural landscape, philosophical landscape, spiritual landscape, and certainly part of the political landscape. So, for example, if you take the Indian flag, there's a wheel in the center of the Indian flag, and that wheel represents the first sermon of the Buddha at Sarnath. If you take the national symbol of India, the national symbol of India is the 4 lions, and this is the lion capital of King Ashoka, the man who did the most to popularize Buddhism as a religion, as a faith, as we understand it. Buddha, Hinduism really, modern Hinduism is based very largely on what it absorbed from Buddhism. In fact, the Buddha is the 9th avatar, the 9th incarnation of Vishnu, one of the main Indian gods. So Buddha got appropriated into the main Brahminical tradition sometime in the 7th century. And at a time when Buddhism was taking root in other parts of Asia, it was getting eliminated from its land of its birth because Hinduism was absorbing the basic tenets of its philosophy, and Islam was, of course, coming into India. So India is a paradox. The Buddhist population in India is just about, in a population of 1.34 billion, there are only about 6 million, 7 million Buddhists in pockets of India. But Buddha is very much, as I said, part of every Indian home. Buddha is very much part of Indian civilization, Indian culture, Indian politics. And in recent decades, Buddha, as I explained in my talk, Buddha has become an instrument of social emancipation. Buddha has become as a symbol of social protest against caste orthodoxy, not just against animal sacrifice. He was the first to propagate the ending of animal sacrifice in India. But he, most importantly, I think, he represents to a growing number of Indians the iconic figure who battled caste orthodoxy, which is still very much prevalent in India. So as a religion, as a faith, Buddhism may not be preponderant in India, unlike, say, for example, in Sri Lanka or Bhutan or Thailand or Myanmar or other parts of Asia. But I can tell you that Buddha is very much part of the Indian landscape. And Dharmapala, we owe a huge debt to Dharmapala, because in the early part of the 19th century, the late part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, it was Dharmapala who, through the Maha Bodhi Society, took up the cause of restoration and renovation and revival of Buddhist sites in India. And of course, we had Sir John Marshall, who did the famous Takshila excavations, and we found the Gandhara, the presence of Buddha in the western part of India. So it's a paradoxical situation, but increasingly, Buddhism may not have resonance in India, but Buddha has total resonance. The life of Buddha particularly.
There's a question here. Thank you very much. There's a question here from Elizabeth Harris, who you know, and I think you quote her in your book.
Oh, I've benefited enormously from Dr. Harris's work.
Well, she's here in the audience. I mean, Elizabeth, would you like to ask yourself a question? If you unmute yourself, you can ask. Elizabeth, I don't know how to find you. Let me see.
There you are. As you know, I know the poem well, and I'd like you to reflect on the qualities of the Buddha that Arnold stressed, because I'm sure this was part of the attraction of the poem. It was this figure of compassion, of course, but what else? Social emancipation was part of this. But it was the qualities that Arnold kind of put into his image of the Buddha that was so attractive to Victorians and people throughout the world in the 19th century. So I'd just like you to reflect on the broader portrayal and what qualities Arnold links with the Buddha.
Well, thank you, Dr. Harris. I'm very privileged to have you present at this talk, because I have benefited hugely from reading your work. I'm a great admirer of your work, and I'm very happy to have you here. Yes, actually, it was a literary gem. It was a literary masterpiece. And its first impact was a literary impact. As you know, at roughly the same time that Edwin Arnold's poem was published, Rhys Davids's work on Buddhism were also being published. Max Muller also had written about Buddhism. But much to the consternation of Rhys Davids and Max Muller and all these great scholars, it is this poem that went viral. It's this poem that became a sensation. And in fact, Rhys Davids reviewed The Light of Asia and said that it's a fine poem, but is unlikely to have commercial success. But as it turned out, Rhys Davids's book never had commercial success, but the poem had great commercial success. And I think one of the reasons, Dr. Harris, is that immediately on the publication of this poem in July 1879, it becomes a rage in America because it was taken up by the transcendental movement. Walt Whitman, that movement of Walt Whitman and Emerson and Thoreau, it's taken up by Oliver Wendell Holmes, one of the great names of the transcendental movement in Boston. And this becomes a huge rage in America. And I think because it became such a huge rage in America, it went into multiple editions and multiple revisions of publications of the work in England as well. And pretty soon, of course, German and French and Russian and Dutch translations started coming out. So I think the impact was the literary impact. The impact was the Buddha, the figure of compassion. Buddha, the figure who didn't demand belief in divinity. A Buddha that didn't demand, subservience to a god. The Buddha that was telling you about ethics and morality at a time when there was growing doubt about the Christian church, when there was growing spread of secularization in Western societies. And there was also this great scientific advances, which was leading to a gradual disenchantment with the Bible and, biblical and the biblical anchors for the age of the earth and other, phenomenon. So I think Buddha, there was hunger and there was appetite for a Buddha-like figure at a time of great economic advance and social discontent and religious doubt. And here was Edwin Arnold presenting such a figure, a pre-Christ, Christ-like figure, in a way. And I think it is that really appealed. The imagery that you say of the life of the Buddha from when he was born till he died, and the language that Edwin Arnold uses. I need hardly remind you, that the language that he used became immortal and became part of Indian of world literature. But in India, in the subcontinent, it was not so much the literary impact. It was not so much the English poem that had an impact. It was the translations that had an impact. The Bengali, the Marathi, the Hindi, the Tamil, the Malayalam. So, it's an unusual poem. In English, it has a literary impact. But in its translations, it has a social impact. It becomes sort of the abiding text for social radicals and social revolutionaries. But you're absolutely right. It's the quality of the poem that really caught the imagination in the West. And once it became a rage in the West, it was only a matter of time before that rage got transferred, back to India and other countries, like Japan. The Buddhist countries, the king of Thailand, for example, became one of the great popularizers of this poem. It became a very popular poem in Japan. So it becomes very popular in the Buddhist countries, and then, of course, it comes to India and then it starts getting translated and so on. But I think, the fact that people like other literary figures like Rudyard Kipling and, so on and so forth, Tolstoy later on in the Russian context, were taken up by this poem. And because of their interest in the life of the Buddha, also, I think, contributed to its phenomenal success. I mean, today we would not read the poem. Anybody who's interested in the life of the Buddha has very many books to read on how Buddhism began, or the social origins or the life of the Buddha. But for the period 1879, I would say up to 1920, for a 40-50 year period, this remained a very popular work, a popular introduction to the life of the Buddha, as I'm sure you know better than me because you're such a great scholar.
Well, can I just say thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure to hear you speak and to hear you speak about the book. And of course, I got it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, there's another, thank you, Elizabeth. There's another question here. What is it about the poem that fires the imagination of radicals and campaigners?
Well, there are sections of the poem when Siddhartha, Gautama Siddhartha, before he becomes the Buddha, has encounters with what were then called the untouchables. This is the Indian caste system. And to simplify a very complex caste system, it's a vertically hierarchical caste system, and you have people at the bottom of the system who are considered to be untouchables by the upper castes. And Gautama Siddhartha is feeling very thirsty. He needs to drink some water, and there's no water in sight. But there is a young, and this is in Edwin Arnold's telling, there's a young untouchable boy who has the water, who has a pitcher of water, but is reluctant to give it to Gautama because he thinks he would be, transgressing caste boundaries by giving water to somebody who's clearly his caste superior. And Gautama then tells this young boy that, are you out of your mind? There is no such thing as caste. Caste is, you're not born into a caste. There's no such thing as caste. We're all equal. When we die, we are all equal. If you look at our blood, we are the same. So, Edwin Arnold, in very poetic language, describes this encounter of Gautama Siddhartha before, this is just on his way to becoming enlightened, to getting enlightenment in Bodh Gaya. So that's one example of how Buddha was not just seen as the man who preached the Eightfold Path, or they gave the world the Four Noble Truths, or who spoke of nirvana, but more importantly, as a man who challenged the orthodoxy of the Brahmins, which kept large numbers of people subjugated because of the accident of their birth. So this is what gave the poem. And you see what happened in India, this poem got translated into regional languages, and it immediately caught the attention of the social revolutionaries in the early part of the 20th century, who were challenging the caste orthodoxy, who were challenging the upper caste hegemony and dominance. So it's not so much the poem per se, but it's the subject of the poem that became, the iconic inspiration for these social revolutionaries. I mean, one of the reasons why the Light of Asia became the phenomenon it became was because the subject was of such profound interest, because there was so much curiosity about who this Buddha was, who was being discovered archaeologically, who was being discovered textually, who was being discovered epigraphically. Who was this Buddha? What did he preach? And, the fact that he lived 400 years before Christ was something that confounded Western society. He was a completely different figure. So it is this, I think, that really fired the imagination of people, particularly in India. I wouldn't say this in other parts of the world. I think in other parts of the world, it had a literary and a cultural and a spiritual impact. But in India, it certainly had a profound social impact.
I mean, what I find interesting is that, this polarization between the caste system and the non-caste system is expressed in religious terms, whereas now it tends to be expressed almost entirely politically, between the Republicans and the Democrats, between the Conservative Party and the Socialist Party and so on. The expression here is religious. And I think that's one of the great things about Buddhism. It maintains a really spiritual core to it, and so it doesn't lead to the grotesque sort of things that happen in socialist governments, which tend to lead to autocratic regimes and tyrannies and all the rest of it. Just as a thought.
Absolutely. Going back, Dr. Biddulph, to the question that was asked earlier, the disappearance or the elimination of Buddhism as a creed, as a faith, as a religion in India, the land of its birth. Well, modern day Hinduism, the two foundational pillars of Hinduism, which we take to be the pillars of Hinduism, ahimsa, which is non-violence, and karuna, which is compassion, both are Buddhist tenets. So in many ways, Hindus may not accept it, but the fact is that Hinduism became Hinduism as we understand it today, largely because it incorporated some of the teachings, many of the precepts of the Buddha, and compassion, karuna, what is called karuna, compassion, and ahimsa, which is non-violence, certainly. Ahimsa also came from the Jain tradition, which was roughly a contemporary social movement, a philosophical movement, spiritual movement, as that of Gautam Buddha. But karuna certainly came from the Buddhist tradition and is one of the defining principles of modern day Hindu culture.
Good. Well, I think that brings us to the end of our hour, and it's probably quite late for you, and I'm sure you have to get up early and do all sorts of things. But I'm very grateful to you for coming. And can I just say, don't forget to go to the bookshelf, buy this book. It's a wonderful book.
Well, I was very privileged to have the Dalai Lama write the foreword to the book. So I think one of the attractions of the book is really the foreword, which is a very moving and a very, very, very personal foreword that the Dalai Lama wrote.
It is. It's a very touching and a real tribute to the book as well. And long may those values expressed in the book. May they spread and may they propagate. I should also say we have reviewed the book in the middle way, your new middle way. And as an afterthought, if any of you have a few coins in your pocket to contribute to the Buddhist Society, be most welcome, as we've been closed now for almost 2 years. And I want to thank you very, very much indeed, really, for your time and for your giving us this talk today on this special 97th anniversary of the Buddhist Society. I think it's most fitting. And when you come, we'll make sure that the chair is nicely polished, and we will set it up in front of the portrait of Sir Edwin Arnold, and we'll give you a very nice tea. We're certainly open online, but not in person.
Thank you very much.
Interestingly enough, the person who did the review in the Telegraph, he came to the Buddhist Society because he'd read somewhere that Edwin Arnold used to hide jewels and jewelry in furniture in his house. So he got hold of the chair and almost dismantled it, looking for jewels or hidden pockets in it where there might be some valuable precious stones. He didn't find any.
Well, I just want to say, Dr. Biddulph, that if any of the people who are attending this seminar would like to get in touch with me by email, I would be more than happy to be in touch with them. And of course, you have my email contact. So anybody...
We'll send it out.
Yeah, if anybody at any point wants to get in touch with me for anything, I would be more than glad to keep in touch and take this conversation forward.
Good. Thank you very, very much indeed. Well, I think that brings us to the end of our talk today. And thank you all very much for coming. It's a great joy to see you all, and especially you, a speaker. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Biddulph. Thanks to all of you, and hope to be in touch with you.
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
Bye now.